Hello, Augies. I'm Dave Kassler, amateur radio call sign KE0OG and Chief Augie. Welcome to Ask Dave 125. Today's subject is more on DMR, specifically the very recently released Baofeng RD-5R, which they built jointly with Radioddity. We'll take a close look at the radio, which sells for $75 either direct from China or via Amazon. I'll give you a hint as to the outcome. It's a nice little radio. Let's see what's in the box, from which I've removed all of the plastic beforehand. First, the radio. If this looks familiar, it is on purpose. We'll talk about its identical twin in a moment. Digging down further in the cardboard, we find another box containing a no driver needed programming cable, the hand strap, an earpiece with a microphone, an antenna, a belt clip, and a charger with wall wart power supply. Two things to note. The antenna has the female end of the small SMA connector, meaning the male end with its exposed center pin is on the radio. Baofeng and Oshing have done it this way for a while, which is opposite everyone else. So if you have an adapter cable that adapts the Baofeng or Oshing radio, it may likely not work on other radios, including the Radioddities. So you will need two sets of adapters as you increase your radio collection. The other thing to note is that the charger wants 10 volts, not 12. This is something to keep carefully in mind because it uses the same connector as normal 12-volt supplies. Putting 12 volts to this cable can overheat things badly in the charger and potentially cause a fire. So carefully mark your cables and double-check the labels before charging the radio. This is a very small radio. In fact, you may see a strong family resemblance to the Baofeng UV5R, an FM-only, fully analog radio that's been on the market for some time and is now available in the $25 US category and is in wide use. If we look closely at the two radios, the only physical difference is the slightly larger battery pack on the RD-5R. Interestingly, though, the larger battery pack bears the same part number as the one that came with my Baofeng UV5R, which I've had for a few years now. If I weigh the two radios without antennas, however, the RD-5R actually comes out just a hair-tad lighter than its older brother. However, once you turn on the two, the difference in screen layout is apparent immediately. Let's set the older brother aside and concentrate on the DMR radio. DMR stands for Digital Mobile Radio. It's an international standard. Up until recently, most DMR radios in the United States were made by Motorola and were correspondingly expensive. Recently, the Chinese have tried to get into the DMR market, not just for amateur radio, but across the board of DMR users like first responders, firefighters, police, sheriff, mountain rescue, and so on. Their first efforts, such as the Radioddity GD55, revealed a rather general rush to market. But these second and third generation Chinese radios are a significant improvement. They're more solid, put out generally more power, and have manuals that are more useful and easier to read. Given that the RD-5R is a very recently released radio, in fact, I received it just prior to its release, I went to Radioddity's website for the manual and for the programming software. Unlike most Baofeng radios, you can't use chirp, but must use the software specific for the radio. Let me editorialize here for a moment. Each new DMR radio seems to have its own way of being programmed and its own unique software to do the job. This proliferation is problematic. The sum total of all the parameters programmed into a DMR radio is called a code plug. When DMR first came out, there really weren't that many different models of radios in use, mostly all Motorola. Thus it became possible to publish code plugs. But now, with the proliferation of radios, it becomes harder to find a code plug that works for you. What's needed is some standardization. A good standard will allow for radios to have unique features, but the main code plug, which looks an awful lot alike between different radios, can be standard with a standard uploader. Or organizations such as those that make Chirp can come out with a piece of standard software that can program all radios. Chirp is like that now for analog radios, but hasn't made the jump yet to digital radios. Anyway, my opinion. In the meantime, the RD-5R software is readily available for Windows. This is a fully featured radio that will do all the FM work that the original UV5R does. That's important. It's a fully capable FM radio for use with traditional repeaters. Plus, it is a competent digital radio. Let's look at some of the interesting features. As just noted, the radio looks very much like its older brother, down to identical information on the buttons in white. However, there's a difference between what's in blue on the numeric keypad. There's a VFO/MR button to switch between VFO mode, sometimes called frequency mode, in which you can enter frequencies directly. Memory recall, or MR, mode is sometimes called channel mode. After the welcome screen, you'll note that there is a frequency listed in the upper and lower portions. You can change between them by pressing the AB button. If you press the monitor button on the side, you turn the flashlight on. Press it again and it blinks. Press it again and it's off. Personally, I would like to see little flashlights on mobile radios. A long push on the bottom button puts the radio into monitor, which means it's listening only on the transmit frequency. This is sometimes called reverse. The push-to-talk button is a standard button. Pressing the orange button on top, labeled call, switches the standard FM broadcast band receiver on. If any signal comes in on the ham frequency you're monitoring, the FM radio is immediately suspended. Over on the other side, you see the place where the microphone and speaker may be attached. As it turns out, this is also where the programming cable is attached. Note that the programming cable uses audio in and out, so you need to turn up the audio to about halfway when you're going to use the programming cable. As I mentioned before, the battery charger is driven by 10 volts and not 12. Make sure that you use the correct wall wart. The radio does not come fully charged, so put it in the charger for several hours until the light turns green. If you want to power the radio with a 12-volt battery, you will need to use a battery eliminator. The radio actually works on 7.4 volts, which is very different from the Japanese radios like the ICOMs, Yaesus, and Kenwoods, and so forth, so you will need to use a battery eliminator. It goes on in place of the battery and then plugs into the electrical utility plug in your vehicle. I bought one once for an Oshing radio, but have used it very little. I simply charge my batteries before starting the adventure of the day. I should note here that this is a 2-band radio. A lot of DMR work in the United States is on 70 centimeters, but some is starting to appear on 2 meters. So this radio works on both. I tested the output power using my MFJ 849 digital SWR watt meter. It shows that in FM, the radio puts out about 5 watts on 2 meters and about 4 watts on UHF. It's harder to tell for DMR because in DMR the radio is only transmitting on one of the 2 possible time slots. One of the traditional complaints about the early Chinese DMR radios was that they were not fully compatible with DMR Tier 2 in the US. The Chinese manufacturers had built to the standard, but the problem is that the standards never cover everything, and so they got some things wrong. The big one of these was the time slots. There's a time slot 1 and a time slot 2, and so two radios can use the channel at the same time using time division multiple access, or TDMA. When you set up a channel, you have to specify which time slot to use. To demonstrate that there are two time slots, let's transmit on a DMR channel, in this case Parrot, and listen on that same frequency using the FM mode. We get this motorboating sound, which is the result of the DMR radio switching on and off very rapidly so that it transmits only in its assigned time slot. Okay, let's take a look at the software. I point out in passing that the Chinese manufacturers have all listened carefully to the early feedback from American hams that the radios were very difficult to program from the front panel. So they have tried to rearrange menus and so on to help do that. However, it's just flat easier to do it via the computer. The software can be downloaded from the Radioddity website. I couldn't find it on the Baofeng website. The software installs promptly and puts an icon on the Windows desktop. Click on this icon. You'll see a pretty blank screen. Click on the plus to open the radio. You'll see several things that are common with most other DMR radios, starting with basic information and then down into the guts of DMR. The first thing to do is to download the information from the radio. So, turn the radio on. You'll hear the computer recognize it with a beep. Then click Program, then click Read. You should get a status bar showing what is read. By the way, this process reads out the entire contents of the memory in the radio. You cannot read just part of it or write just part of it. It's an all or nothing deal, so it takes a moment because it is downloading every single memory location, even if they're filled with zeros, and the same for writing back to the radio. Note, as the radio is downloading, the red light will blink. Once done, you can turn the radio off if you want to save the battery, because now all of the work will be done on the computer. Click the little square next to the RD-5R to get all of the information laid out. You can click through the menus. Note that you have to double-click on an item to get it to open up. This first basic information screen shows the ranges of the radio, which are VHF and UHF, the most recent programming date, which was yesterday in this case, the model number, the hardware version, firmware version, and DSP version. Serial number and CPS are blank. There's nothing on this screen that you can change. The boot item and menu screen contain some information that you probably can just leave alone for right now. The number key assignment is a little more interesting. There are 10 keys, and these can be assigned to different contacts. This is a shortcut method that gets around having to get to the right channel. Let's leave it alone for now. The next screen, General Settings, has a couple things on this that you want to pay attention to. I'm going to put my call sign in the radio name. Now, the next one is the radio ID. You need to go to a website with the URL shown on the screen to get your own unique radio ID. This identifies you as you. As it turns out, you can use the same radio ID on all of your DMR radios, since there's only a very small chance that you'll be talking to yourself. If your spouse is a ham and you want to communicate with him or her, then they need their own radio ID also. The radio ID does not come instantaneously from the website, but rather they take a day or two and then you'll get it via email. You've got to have this before you get started for real with DMR. You can put a dummy ID in there for a day or so, but make sure you get it fixed when you get your real one. You will notice later as you are talking with people on the radio that their radio ID shows up on your radio screen. This is sort of a form of caller ID.
Firmware updates, there's still a couple of bugs here and there, but so far they're doing great, and I recommend it to anybody. Well, that sounds like a good radio and a real good price, $215. That's about what the 2017's going for. Now, what name is actually on that HD1?
In the section on alert tone, I've gone ahead and enabled the tones, which is nice. It's sort of like the beep when you're done talking on the repeater. You know when somebody is finished. Otherwise, it's completely silent and very hard to tell if the other person is actually finished or just pausing. The next screen is called Buttons. It's unique to this radio. The orange button marked Call is SK1, and the bottom button marked Money is SK2. The way they come preset, you can change them. The orange button turns on the FM radio capability with a short press. Long press is unprogrammed. You could put something in there. On the bottom button, we have the flashlight on short press, and a long press gives you the monitor function, which you can use with FM repeaters to listen to the repeater input frequency rather than the output frequency. The next screen has to do with privacy. That's another word for encryption. In the United States, the content of all amateur radio transmissions must be in the clear. In other words, encryption, sometimes masquerading as privacy, cannot be used in the United States. Just leave the screen alone. The next screen, Signaling System, contains some information that allows you to punch certain buttons on your radio to signal that you are having an emergency. This is a relic of using these radios for public service agencies, and I've not heard of any hams setting this up. That doesn't mean they won't, because hams can find a use for anything. Okay, now on to something really important, the contacts. Contacts can be one of two things. They can be individual people, or they can be groups. I know that calling a group of people a contact is very odd, but by and large, that's the magic of DMR. A group of people is a set of hams that you may wish to talk to, not listed by call sign, but by geographic area. So if you have a group of people who want to talk to each other in the area of the local repeater, the name of this group of people talking to each other, or in DMR speak, a talk group, you would select the contact called Local 9. Now, I know that doesn't make a lot of sense at first, but just to equate Local 9 with all the people you can reach on your local repeater who are listening to Local 9 at the time. Now, here's the important part. You can name anything you want, but the call ID is the number associated with the call group, which is centrally assigned. Not assigned by the repeater owner, but centrally assigned. Yes, it is possible to list individuals here and then provide their assigned call ID. This is probably the hardest part of DMR to understand. So if you've got it, great. Now, a couple of special things going on here to note. The name TAC 310 has a call ID of 310. Now here's where it gets interesting. DMR repeaters are all over the world, and they're interconnected via the internet. Any repeater that lists TAC310 as one of its channels essentially becomes part of the TAC310 party line. So if I switch my radio to TAC310 and announce my call, it is being heard everywhere on every repeater that has attached to the 310 talk group. I showed this in the last video, where I set my radio for TAC310 and talked with people in California, Kansas, and Oklahoma. This is the real magic of DMR. As it turns out, TAC310 is assigned to the entire United States. Now, the next interesting talk group is the one named Parrot. This so-called talk group is on most repeaters and isn't a talk group at all. Rather, it will record what you say and parrot it back to you, hence the word parrot. This is a really great way to test your radios and see what you sound like without interrupting others. Now, zones are very important. The zone is like a bank of channels, and I think the best way to explain it is to give an example. If I have a couple of zones, I can name one Salt Lake and the other one Grand Junction. And then, under the zone named Salt Lake, I can pick channels that I want to have in that zone. Note that if I want to use the same talk group that I might be using in Grand Junction, it would be on a repeater in Salt Lake on a different channel. Now, there is a way in the radio's menu to change zones fairly easily. And you only have to do that once when entering the different area, and then you're using the channel that you have chosen for that zone. So, finally we get down to channels. But the rig will actually handle quite a few channels. I have 16 listed here. Note the little symbol, the digital icon, as well as the symbol for an analog channel. I only have 5 channels listed: TAC310, Parrot, Local 9, good old 146.52 Simplex FM, and the worldwide talk group. So I can pick any one of these channels, and this is where we get to the nitty-gritty of what's going on. For each channel, I select the mode, which is either digital or analog, along with the channel name, in this case TAC310. Now, note that that will go back to the digital contact list, so it can pick up the underlying number that it needs. So there has to be proper correlation between all of these things. The receiver frequency is the one that the repeater transmits on. In this case, 446.9125 megahertz. The little button here will put that same frequency over to the transmit frequency, but you'll notice I then edited it to subtract 5 megahertz from that for the transmit frequency, because that's the split on 70 centimeters. Power set to high, which would mean 5 watts. I don't have this channel on the scan list. I could have multiple scan lists. Allow talk around means if for some reason the repeater isn't working, to talk directly to other people on the repeater's output frequency. Okay, shown at the bottom half, one side is grayed out. That's the analog one. If this were an analog channel, this is where you would put in your CTCSS tones and what kind of signaling system you're using and so on, and the bandwidth. On to the digital side. So you need to know some things about the repeater: the input-output frequencies, the color code, and which time slot the desired talk group is on. Everybody using that repeater has to use the right color code. Okay, right now we're dealing with the TAC310 contact, and it's going to be repeater slot 1. Now there are 2 repeater slots, time slot 1 and time slot 2, and we're using time slot 1. So here's an example of an analog signal. It's simplex, so there's no offset between the receive and transmit frequencies. No tone is used, so tones are set to off. Usually US repeaters don't transmit a CTCSS tone, but most repeaters need to hear their CCTSS tone, so you have to transmit it. That's this one here on the right. Okay, now that we've made these changes, let's save them. The system suggests a name based on the time that you opened the program. You may want to use something more meaningful like RD-5R March code plug. The saved file is in fact the so-called code plug. If someone else has the identical radio, they can use your code plug to program their radio and vice versa. Over time, you will note that in certain areas, people tend to use the same radio model to make sharing code plugs easier. Now, the last step is to write this file to the radio. Click on Program and then Write. The green light flashes to indicate that the programming is going on and will turn off when everything is done. Note that you are writing every single possible channel on this radio, and it has quite a few. 16 come already set up, but there are many more that you can use. You know, the free programming cable is a very nice feature because the programming cables for some of the Japanese radios can be quite pricey. And some Japanese manufacturers charge good money for the software. So it's nice that for Chinese radios, both come with the radio without extra charge. I've noticed here recently that the Chinese manufacturers, because of all the hoopla over the counterfeit prolific chips, have switched to a cable that does not require any driver at all. That sure makes things easier. So let's show a conversation in progress using this radio. I mounted a new 10-element Yagi antenna outdoors so that I could do last week's Ask Dave video. I used that same antenna this week and had decided to stand right at the antenna so I didn't have to worry about losses in the cables and make the contact. There are a couple of things you'll note. One is that there is no squelch tail, so sometimes it's hard to tell when the person has stopped talking. There are optional tones and stuff that you can set, and I set all that I can get to because I just like to know where I am in the QSO. If the radio cannot consummate a link with the repeater, it will tell you that it has failed to do so, but not necessarily right away, so be aware of this. DMR sounds different from analog FM. It's more digital and has less fidelity than FM. If the signal is just strong enough to get into the repeater, but not strong enough to get in reliably, you'll hear very strange tones. I've heard these referred to as the R2-D2 tones. For those of you who haven't seen Star Wars, R2-D2 was the robot who spoke in beeps and squeaks. Note on DMR that failure of a link is not graceful. On FM, the link starts to get scratchier and scratchier, and then finally you lose it. Whereas on DMR, if the link is starting to go bad, it just simply gives strange digital artifacts or disappears and you don't know exactly what's going on all the time. However, if you have a good, strong signal into the repeater, you can be pretty sure that if you're hearing weird digital artifacts, that they are probably on the other end. You know, in commercial radio, the idea is to have a very solid radio link all the time. So people go to great expense to put up the appropriate repeaters and towers. In amateur radio, we're willing to tolerate less than perfect. And so that means we're okay with occasional garbling. Note that in the manual, the URL given for Baofeng is www.baofengradio.com. Make sure you include the www. Baofeng says that they've had problems with people appropriating the counterfeit Baofeng name and using it for other websites, and it makes it clear on this particular website that this is the only authorized website. Anyway, this radio happens to be supported by Radioddity rather than Baofeng, so you would go to radioddity.com. The manual and the software are readily available. The manual has some issues in these big tables in that if you look under the description of settings, sometimes lines tend to cross other lines and so on. They need to get that sorted out, but what they have here is, by and large, pretty good and pretty thorough. I commend them, in fact, on their manual. You buy on Amazon or direct from their website for the same price, $75 US. Note that it says fulfilled by Amazon, which means shorter shipping times in the USA. As it turns out, you can also download the software directly from the Amazon site. Let's listen briefly to an edited conversation using this radio talking to the Grand Junction repeater. Hello, Sam. This is Dave, KE0OG. Are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, very good. I've forgotten your call sign. Could you give me that again?
My call is November 0 Golf Tango Oscar, N0 GTO.
Okay, great. N0 GTO, KE0OG, standing here in Ridgeway and talking to you in Grand Junction. Just out of curiosity, kind of what part of Grand Junction are you in? I'm vaguely familiar with the... we don't go up there often. I know where St. Mary's is, because I'm an old guy, but we've been up there a few times. Well, like we go maybe twice a month, something like that. Usually hit one of the big boxes and bring home stuff that's cheaper than down here. Go ahead.
Okay, Dave. Well, I'm west of First Street, about I don't know, probably quarter to a half a mile, which puts me about a quarter of a mile east of Sam's Club. So that'll get me located for you.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, the radio here is a Baofeng RD-5R. It's not released yet. Radioddity is apparently actually doing the releasing. They're doing this in conjunction with Baofeng. And so I've reviewed several Radioddity radios. So they sent this one to me. And in the past, it's been difficult to review DMR radios with no DMR repeater around, but and now we have this new one here, and I'm standing out back, so I don't have my notes in front of me. Was it W0BL or BX that put this up?
Yeah, well, it was Bill W0BX who put this out. I don't know as much about it as some of the other guys down here. My wife and I head south for the winters down around the Lake Havasu, Quartzsite area, and so this is all real new to me, but it is Bill W0BX who put this repeater up.
Okay, great. I keep waiting for a beep at the end of the transmission. I guess DMR doesn't do that. I have a lot to learn, and I'm trying to learn it very fast. To use these radios now, I have several that work. And the Radioddity GD77 works real fine from inside the house with this antenna in about 25 feet of coax maybe. And so it does pretty well. Well, Sam, I've got to run back in and get busy. I've got to get a video out tomorrow. And so your voice will be famous, as the other guy said. And thanks, appreciate it very much. So I'll say 73. I should make note that we're on local 9, which is the local repeater, so we're not tying up a worldwide network here. Thank you very much. Let's see, it's GTO, if I remember right. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct. November 0 Golf Tango Oscar, N0 GTO. All right, well, thanks. Glad I could help. N0 GTO clear.
Okay, great. Catch you later. N0 GTO, KE0OG 73. So the bottom line is that this $75 US radio performs quite well. It's in a tiny little package, which makes it very easy to slip into a pocket. My experience with it is positive. If you go to the link shown on the screen below, you can go to a page on Amazon to buy it. It's at the standard price, and you can use your Prime and all that sort of stuff, but I will get a small finder's fee to help support Ham Radio Answers. In addition, if you go to the page at dcasler.com/support, you'll find several ways that you can support Ham Radio Answers. There's the tip jar right there, and a link to the Patreon page, and also if you wish to purchase the amateur extra lessons on a thumb drive, that's there. There's also a list of links to Amazon that you can use, which again cost you no more, but give Ham Radio Answers a finder's fee. I sure do appreciate all you Augies and all that you do to support this channel. Thank you so very much. Don't forget that on Saturday mornings at noon U.S. Eastern Daylight Time, which would be 1800 UTC, you can tune to YouTube Live to the code practice lessons I've been giving. I want to just clear up a little bit of confusion about that. This is not a one-time code class and then we're done, but rather this is a perpetual code practice session so people can join at any time and take off at any time. I've divided the various letters that we're learning into groups, and we'll really focus on each group during a lesson. Again, perseverance is everything, and you will build up to the ability to use code on the air. And so to all you Augies out there, thank you again. Use both feet when walking, and 73. I have 2 more DMR radios that need testing. I've run into a couple of logistical issues on both of them, but hope to have at least one ready for next week.